October 1941. German Army Group Center pushed toward Moscow with momentum built over months of rapid advance. Commanders believed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. The expectation was clear: one final offensive, one final push, and the war in the East would be decided before winter arrived. Before the cold arrived, the ground itself turned against them. Autumn rains transformed roads into mud, immobilizing vehicles and delaying supply lines. Progress slowed, but commanders still believed the delay was temporary. Winter was seen as a factor, but not yet as a threat. German troops were not equipped for prolonged winter operations. Many units lacked proper cold weather clothing, relying instead on uniforms designed for autumn conditions. The assumption remained that the campaign would conclude before severe temperatures set in. The first snowfall arrived in early November. At first, it was seen as a minor inconvenience, a seasonal shift rather than a strategic factor. But within days, temperatures dropped sharply, and the nature of the battlefield began to change in ways few had anticipated. Rifles and machine guns began to malfunction as lubricants froze. Soldiers reported bolts sticking, triggers locking, and weapons failing at critical moments. Equipment designed for moderate climates was now operating in conditions it had not been built to endure. Temperatures dropped to levels many soldiers had never experienced. Frostbite became common. Simple tasks, loading ammunition, adjusting equipment, became difficult as hands lost sensation. The cold was no longer a background condition, it was a direct threat to survival. In letters home, German soldiers began to describe conditions in stark terms. Words like unbearable and impossible appeared with increasing frequency. What had been expected to be a short campaign was becoming something entirely different. Engines failed to start. Fuel thickened in the cold. Trucks and tanks were left immobilized, unable to move without extensive preparation. Mobility, which had defined the early stages of the campaign, was rapidly disappearing. Artillery crews struggled to operate their weapons. Recoil systems malfunctioned, and shells had to be handled carefully to prevent damage. Fire support, once reliable, became inconsistent as mechanical limitations increased. Soviet troops, equipped with winter clothing and familiar with the environment, began to operate more effectively. Their ability to move, fight, and survive in the cold contrasted sharply with German difficulties, shifting the balance on the battlefield. Digging into frozen ground required significant effort. Trenches and defensive positions were harder to establish, leaving troops exposed. The environment itself limited the ability to prepare for sustained combat. Many soldiers lacked proper shelter, sleeping in makeshift positions exposed to the elements. The cold affected rest, reducing effectiveness and increasing exhaustion over time. Frostbite injuries increased steadily, reducing unit strength without combat. Medical resources were limited, and evacuation was difficult. The cold was inflicting casualties independent of enemy action. Logistics became increasingly strained. Supplies could not reach frontline units consistently, affecting ammunition, food, and medical support. The ability to sustain operations was weakening. Continuous exposure to cold and limited resources led to fatigue. Units that had advanced rapidly months earlier were now struggling to maintain basic operational capability. Night temperatures dropped far below anything most German soldiers had experienced. Reports described rifles freezing solid within minutes and boots stiffening as if made of wood. What had been expected as a seasonal inconvenience was now understood as a permanent operational condition that would define survival itself. Command structures began to feel the strain. Orders that relied on speed, coordination, and timing became difficult to execute when units could not move or communicate effectively. The environment imposed limits that strategy alone could not overcome, forcing commanders to adapt in real time. Soldiers writing home described conditions that contradicted earlier expectations. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. The language shifted from victory to endurance, from progress to survival. What had once been a campaign of movement was becoming a struggle to maintain position. Winter altered more than temperature. Frozen ground carried sound differently, and clear air extended visibility across long distances. These changes affected tactics, exposing movements that would have gone unnoticed before. German units were forced to adapt quickly to conditions they had not trained for. Mechanical reliability declined sharply. Tank crews spent hours attempting to keep engines operational, often lighting fires beneath vehicles to prevent freezing. Maintenance became a constant requirement, diverting time and manpower away from combat readiness. Rations frequently froze solid, forcing soldiers to thaw them before consumption. Some used body heat, others small fires that risked detection. Frostbite and exposure began to reduce unit strength significantly. Medical facilities struggled to cope with the growing number of non-combat injuries. The cold was now inflicting losses independent of enemy action, reshaping the composition of frontline units. Soviet troops launched counterattacks with increasing confidence. Equipped for winter and familiar with the terrain, they moved effectively across snow-covered ground. German soldiers reported facing an opponent that appeared unaffected by conditions that were degrading their own capabilities. Many soldiers described a sense of disbelief. The severity of the winter had not been anticipated at this stage of the campaign. Assumptions about a short war had shaped preparation, and now those assumptions were proving incorrect in real time. Supply lines deteriorated further as transport became unreliable. Deliveries of ammunition, food, and fuel became inconsistent. Frontline units were forced to operate with limited resources, reducing their ability to sustain prolonged engagement. Continuous exposure to cold, combined with limited supplies, led to widespread exhaustion. Units that had advanced rapidly earlier in the campaign were now struggling to maintain basic operational capability under increasingly harsh conditions. By late November, the operational focus shifted. Instead of advancing, units were holding positions. The objective of reaching Moscow remained, but the ability to achieve it was diminishing under the combined pressure of environment and resistance. Soviet offensives increased in scale and coordination. German soldiers reported being pushed back in areas where they had previously advanced without resistance. The balance of initiative was shifting, marking a critical turning point in the campaign. For many soldiers, the realization came gradually but unmistakably. The war they had expected to end quickly was entering a new phase. Conditions suggested a prolonged conflict requiring endurance rather than rapid movement. By December 1941, the advance on Moscow had stalled. Winter had exposed the limits of planning and preparation. For the soldiers on the ground, the conclusion was clear. The campaign had changed, and the war in the East would not end as quickly as they had believed.